Welcome, everybody. My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And on behalf of the Center and the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, I'm very excited to welcome you to this webinar, the first event of the Center's Fall 2022 calendar, many to come. The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva people and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Sorano, Kuya, Peomkuichum, Ahashaman, Ipai-Tipai, the Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of the lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. You can read a more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the Department of History at USC on their website, and my colleague Maya just put the link to that fuller history and acknowledgement into the chat. Maya has also been putting in a link to, if you would like to know what Indigenous territory you are on, so feel free to share that in the chat as well, or tell us where you're watching from in whatever way you feel moved. As you can tell from my recitation of places at the opening of the webinar, we always love to see where people are watching from. So before we get started, just a note about the Zoom protocols. We'll have time for questions and discussions, so we want to invite and encourage your participation, your questions, your ideas and comments in the chat, and especially using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of the screen in your Zoom controls. You'll also be able to ask questions on audio if you choose by clicking the raise hand button below. And when considering in which form to participate, please keep in mind that this is being recorded and the recording will be made widely available. So if you have concerns or questions about privacy, choose whichever form of participation works best for you. My colleague, Maya, who's been so active in the chat, will be moderating the discussion following the talk today. And so for the sake of the recording, they will be reading the questions to our speaker. And as I mentioned before, just a quick note about the chat. If you want to make sure that everybody sees your message, you select everyone from the dropdown, or if you just want the host and the speakers to see it, you can leave it on host and panelists. Okay, so now to introduce the speaker today, let me introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. Professor Wolf Gruner is the Chabelle Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies at USC and Professor of History. Wolf, I pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Marta, and also thank Maya for kind of organizing everything which led to this minute. Welcome everybody who is participating and attending right now, and we are really happy to see so many people from different parts of the world being interested in today's topic. The event is organized by the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which since its founding in 2014 concentrates its effort in developing innovative interdisciplinary research, focusing on three distinct areas: the resistance to genocide and mass violence, violence, emotion, and behavioral change, and also digital genocide studies. And while doing this, the center organizes a lively academic program, which consists of annual conferences, international conferences, workshops, the lecture series, and then we host numerous fellows and scholars in residence at the center and offer other research opportunities which are unique. So feel free to share these, discover these possibilities on our website, which Maya hopefully puts into the chat. We are also very happy that today's event is co-sponsored by the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. The consortium is a non-profit organization which is relatively young, founded last year with a little bit of a longer history. And this consortium brings together these different academic centers, large and small, on big research universities and small colleges, to secure, integrate, and advance Holocaust, genocide, and human rights education at colleges across the United States. The consortium, which has now several dozen members, offers expertise and support for faculty, directors, administrators, and community leaders to strengthen existing centers, but also help to establish new centers to advance these kind of studies. Today, our webinar is dedicated to the Last Seen initiative, which gathers visual evidence of Nazi deportations from the German Reich between 1938 and 1945. Last Seen is a multi-institutional project, and I think Alina will talk more about this in a second. So this leads me to my pleasure to introduce to all of you to Dr. Alina Bothe, who is the Last Seen project manager. She earned her PhD and her master's in history, political science, and Eastern and Southeastern European history from the Free University in Berlin. She is currently completing a postdoctoral thesis. For those who are not familiar with the German regulations, it's called dehabilitation, which enables academics to teach at German universities. Practically, you can say it's a second PhD, sometimes even more profound than the actual PhD, which she is doing on the persecution and expulsion of the Jews with Polish citizenship in the German Reich between 1938 and 1942. She was awarded several international fellowships, and this brings us to our collaboration because she was awarded in 2015 an international teaching fellowship at the center, which she used to integrate survivor testimonies from the USC Shore Foundation Visual History Archive into a collaborative student project on the persecution of the Polish Jews in Berlin, which then resulted in a widely acclaimed public exhibition, which was open to the public, I think, for more than 2 years in the center of Berlin, and then led also to her current studies, deeper studies on this project. She is already quite accomplished and published several books, and I just want to mention an important book on gender as a historical category of analysis, which she co-edited, another co-edited volume on gender and memory, the Shoah in the digital age. Then a co-edited book and co-authored book on the topic of the expulsion of the Polish Jews, which was based on this exhibition in Berlin. And then most recently, the history of the Shoah in the virtual realm, a critical source analysis. That's my translation because the actual book is in German. So I think you will all looking forward to learn more about her current work, which is, I think, really important to lead this project, Last Seen. I hand over to you, Alina.
Thank you so much, Wolf. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening. Just give me 1 second to upload my presentation and bring it to the point where we're going to start. because it always takes a moment longer than I believe. So there we are. So I hope you all can see it now clearly. What I'm going to do tonight is introducing the new Last Seen initiative or project, and discussing our search for unknown pictures of the Nazi deportations and how we try to decode the pictures we already found. Before I start, I would like to thank Wolf, Martha, and Maya, and also the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. It's such a pleasure that you have organized this event. I said it before, but I'd like to say it now. It always looks quite like an easy task once the Zoom conference is running or the webinar. But before that, it's a lot of work done. So thank you very much. For today, I would shortly like to give you an overview of our project, discuss our approach and aims. Then I brought photos from 2 deportation events that are closely linked, and I will try to show you how we work in the project with these photos, how we try to analyze and decode them. And then I'll give you a short outlook on what happens next in our project. Last Seen is a pretty young project. We started October 1st last year. So at this point, we are running for 10 months. It is a multi-institutional project, as Professor Gruner mentioned. It is the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. It is Arrosen Archives, the Memorial of the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism in Berlin, as well as the new Institute for City History and Remembrance Culture or Memorial Culture in Munich. These are the funding partners of the project so far. What is the material? What are the sources? What are the photos we are working with? And I brought you an example from a city or a town that I guess most of you have never heard of. It is a small town in the south of Germany called Bingen. And it is a quite typical as well as atypical photo series. It shows 3 pictures showing the deportation of Jews from the city on March 3rd, 1942. They've been actually taken by someone who was not ordered to take photos and was not a member of the police, but a member of the public who had a photo camera, as about 10% of the German population at that time had. And this person liked to document whatever was happening around in the city. So once he heard about that a huge event is taking place, that the Jews were, as it was said, transported or evacuated in the perpetrator's language, he ran and took those photos, and he was potentially not really sure if it was okay or not to take these photos. So he took them from quite a distance. And this is the kind of material, for example, that we are working with. And I'll go into these materials more in depth, but I wanted to give you a first visual introduction into the project. When we started October last year, we knew of deportation photos from 27 cities and towns. And this is the last huge project that was done by Klaus Hesse and Philipp Springer in the late 1990s, early 2000 years, and they collected photos from about 27 places. At this point in our research, we know of photos that have been taken at more than 60 places, and as was known before as well, there's some films showing the deportations as well. But at this moment, I'll be focusing on the photos. So a lot of German towns that I'm just giving you the names in the background to give you an introduction into the scope of the project and how it developed it. And it's actually something that surprises all of us being part of this project. the number of places we have found photos so far from. So we know of about 500 plus photos from about 60 places, and they've been taken in between 1938. We are starting with the deportation of Polish Jews, October 27th to 29th, 1938, to the Polish border. And then we try to find photos until the last days of the war, when the liberation started. But so far, we have photos gathered from the years 1938 to 1943, with the majority of photos being taken between autumn 41 to autumn 42. So it's within the time span of 1 year that most of these photos been taken, and that there's been also, it corresponds with the massivity, the hate in deportations taking place from the Reich. This would be, of course, different when we start looking into other countries, but as we are working, as Wolf Gruner mentioned in his introduction, currently within the borders of the Reich from 1937, we have this majority of deportations taken place between 41 and 42. We look at 3 different groups of persecutees. It is Jews, it is Sinti and Roma people, as well as those who fell victim to the euthanasia actions. And what we have from the number of photos we have gathered so far is quite a range of different photographers. But we can see a clear majority, and the clear majority are police photographers, or photographers being ordered by police to take photos, non-Jewish Germans who get a job to take these photos. And then there are also photos being taken for the war chronicles of different towns. A very few photos have been taken in secrecy, 3, 4, 5. It is the absolute minority in the sample we have gathered so far. And there's one case where we have to assume, and this is, it's standing out from our collection so far, from a Jewish perspective. What we do with these photos we are gathering is we are developing a digital picture atlas, and you can see a mock-up right here. What will be in this atlas is potentially photos from all those places you've seen before, the whole series, and you will have a full contextualization, the history of the event, the history of the deportation, and whenever possible, we are trying to identify places as well as people, showing exactly where it happened and who was involved. So once the digital picture atlas is finished, you'll be able to see the picture clear, and you will be able to see the picture with annotations. So you will be able to go over each picture with your mouse, and you will get pop-ups on marked whenever there are markers telling you about who was this person, who was actually Werner Loeb on this photo. And then you'll be able, when we've been able to identify the person, to read their biography as far as we know it. So you will also have information on the photographer, on the city, as much as we can offer. So this is part of what we are developing. And the second part is an educational tool, a learning application in which you play the role of an investigative journalist, and you get a call, and this call tells you that you'll be able to find some interesting photos on an attic. And on this attic where you're going to play, well, this is slightly uncomfortable. I'm just taken the lights out and changed for different lights. Sorry for the short interruption. So, and on this attic, you'll be finding 20 photos taken in May 1942 showing the deportation from Eisenach. And then you'll find clues, and you can walk around this attic and you'll be working with these photos on your own, taking notes, and in the end, you'll be telling the story from the perspective of an investigative journalist. And if technique works, I can now show you a first look into this attic, the three-dimensional attic that we've created, where students will be able to learn with these photos. It will take about 8 seconds. A very quick run through. The learning application will be available in German. The digital picture atlas will be available in German and English. So we're going to stop that and continue. Where are we standing right now? We are preparing to publish. We'll be publishing in March next year. So we've been in negotiations and agreements with many different archives, which is a very interesting experience, very helpful also, but because there's a lot of local knowledge on these photos. We're doing a lot of in-depth research, trying to identify people and places. I'll show you this in a minute. And we have, of course, some of these special finds. And I just show you 2 examples to give you a bit of a feeling on the project. These were the deportation photos or prints that we knew so far from Fulda in a deportation taking place in snow, December 8th, 1941. And we got them from the local archive, who actually had reproductions of reproductions. And we didn't know where the originals were. And my colleague, Katarina Menschik, was able to locate them a few weeks ago in the US, researching at YIVO, and it gives you quite a better impression of what was actually happening at that day in Fulda, because now we have clear pictures showing what was actually going on. And there's, of course, it would be an interesting story to know how they actually were transferred to the US. I personally imagine that is potentially a survivor, because a lot of survivors gathered photos, took them with them to the US, but we don't know yet. And a second of these examples is Breslau, largest German city in the East until 1945, with huge or major Jewish population. And this is the deportation from Schießwerder, from which we knew at the beginning of this project that actually 2 photos would exist. This is the number of photos we have so far, it's 5. And we now can say that we also have photos of a second deportation from Breslau, actually. We are not yet sure which one of the further deportations it were, but it is actually also, we were not sure in the beginning, but these 2 photos are from Breslau as well. So it shows you, I think, some of the materials we have gathered so far, and also some of the additional information and additional photos that we found. So we knew, of course, Breslau photos were existing, but we didn't know the number of photos that were existing. And what we also do not know are the gaps. There were, of course, much more photos than those who were transmission and are still existing, or might be still existing on attics and cellars and archives, in local newspapers from the time we don't know, but we're looking for them. And I think this is a good way to shortly introduce the way how we've been working to this point. So what we've actually done, one of our first steps was a systematic research of all published local materials. So some articles on local persecution, from the 70s, 80s onwards. So what you call gray literature in the German context, when it's not really been published by a huge publishing company or publishing house, but it's a local brochure that's been produced. We've then done a systematic research of digital archival holdings worldwide. I'd rather say, but there's still many more to go. We have done a number of archival research stays in person, and we've been mailing out to 1,750 German archives, and we've got a huge response. A huge number of archives actually send us answers. We did not find a lot on this way, but still also there, we gathered new photos, and we're doing an extensive public search, especially in Germany. There is an exhibition mounted on an old truck from the 1950s, which is quite similar to trucks that have been used during deportations, and it's traveling around Germany, doing some 20 stops in the first year, trying to gather attention on a local level. We have something what we call, it is maybe not the best label, but it works, bring your photo event, where we in person or digitally ask people to share the personal photo albums they have from the time of World War II. And we have a monthly webinar series to create interest in the project. We have, of course, a number of challenges. One of these is copyright issues, and that we do have the same photos or prints in different archives. So which one is actually the original? But what that is a minor. What is a major challenge is that we are repeating. We do a repetition of the perpetrator's perspective and their language. We are reproducing it. So we need to encounter that. And you've seen the folder example. Sometimes we are encountering a quite poor quality of available copies because archives in the 80s scanned the photos and the originals went back to those who had them at the time. And at this point, they are kind of lost. So hopefully we might regain some of these. What we try to develop, looking at these challenges that we have, is a digital curation guideline which says maximum transparency. We try to say what we know, but also what we do not know and where we are not really sure. We're trying to make the gaps and the unknown visible. We're trying to be open about the semantic coding and also the visual language that the perpetrators created. And you'll be seeing this in my examples. And also one of our approaches is to have a different biographical format for the different groups. Those being who'd been persecuted get a different biography to perpetrators who we actually also can identify on some of those photos. So let me get to my first example, which is Halberstadt. The deportation from Halberstadt took place, the first one on April 12th, 1942. 101 people were deported. Halberstadt was quite a center of Jewish Orthodoxy. The rabbinical family Auerbach had been residing there for 4 generations. In the 18th century, already about 10% of the population of Halberstadt had been Jewish. So it had been a quite flourishing Jewish community, also intellectually important. The deportation from Halberstadt went over to Magdeburg, Potsdam, Berlin, and then finally to the ghetto of Warsaw. It is closely connected with the second example, Brandenburg an der Havel, which took place 1 day later. They were also brought to Berlin, and from Berlin, from the Levetzow-Straße, then sent over to the ghetto of Warsaw as well. So it is a joint transport. This is something we encounter quite often, that we have photos of the same transport from different places. So when a deportation actually went through a number of cities, and in a number of cities, Jews were forced to board the train, we have, for example, from 3 of these cities photos. So just to locate Halberstadt very roughly, it is between, in a long line, Hanover and Leipzig. In Sachsen-Anhalt, it is about 200 kilometers from Berlin, in a quite mountainous region of the Harz. And these are the 2 photos that we know of. You will see them in different versions in the next few minutes. This is one of the photos that are in the photo archives at Yad Vashem. And we have one of these difficult perpetrators codings. It says in German Auszug der Kinder Israels, which has a quite anti-Semitic subtone, move out of Israel's children. We have 2 further prints in that archive. You can see in their size, shape, they are different. So we need to discuss that further. And we have these photos discussed in a survivor's testimony from Lothar Beverstein, who gave his testimony to the UC Shoah Foundation in the 1990s. Also his brother, so we have both of them here. And both of these pictures, in a different quality, are in his testimony as well. So this is how these photos are transmissioned. We don't know yet about the story behind them, but I can tell you what Lothar Beverstein tells in his testimony, how he got the prints that he has. He met one of the other survivors from Halberstadt. He was able to emigrate in 1939, and he met the Chazen from Halberstadt, Yehuda Berliner, sometime later in the US. Yehuda Berliner went back in the 50s or 60s to search for information on his wife and daughter. And they are pictured here, and they are identified on these photos. And he gave them these photos. So this is what we know about how he got his photos. This is an enlarged version so that you have a better impression again. And I'll talk about the background in a moment. I would ask you to be aware of the dome, the Halberstadt Dome in the background, which is a large cathedral with a very distinct architecture, and we'll be able to locate it on the next photos. So this is the Halberstadt Dome in the Halberstadt inner city. It is really in the city center. I just go back, make you aware again of the architectural features, and change back into this photo taken in 2013. I think it's pretty clear. We can see the street that leads to the dome, where the deputies had to line up before being marched to the train station. And we can also see the dome. And just to give you a short impression, Halberstadt lost about 80% of buildings in a air raid in 1945, but a part of the city structure still exists. So you have the dome really in the city center here in this aerial view of 2019. You can really see where it actually is and where it is today. Also, the deportation space is marked nowadays by a memorial that was commissioned during the GDR times. So what we know from Lothar Beverstein is that he is able to identify his father and mother on these photos. And they're standing in front of the deportation march. I try to enlarge the picture. Again, we sometimes have these quality issues, but we're gonna work on this. And he tells us that Hugo and Paula Beverstein are standing in the front. What I can tell you about the family is what Lothar tells us about them. They moved in the late 1920s to Halberstadt, and they were running a butchery, a kosher butchery. That was important for Halberstadt because Halberstadt had a quite Orthodox community. They lived in the house that you see in the above, in the middle of the photos above. On the first floor, there was the butchery, and then the family lived on the second and third floor. The eldest daughter, Ella, was able to emigrate in 1936 to the US. Her younger brother Lothar was detained in Buchenwald after the November pogroms in 1938. You see his photo shortly after his release from Buchenwald, with pretty cropped hair, short hair, as he was shaven in Buchenwald. He was then able to get to first the UK and later to the US. So also his younger brother Walter, who's on two of those photos, was able to emigrate. So it was the parents that were still in Halberstadt and then were deported from Halberstadt. They were in close contact, especially with the two boys. The two boys were first in the UK. They were Lothar was then interned as an enemy alien in the UK and shipped to Canada. He was placed in a prisoner of war camp in Ottawa, and it is from there that we have a last postcard that his parents wrote in from the ghetto of Warsaw on April 24th, 1942, 8 days after the arrival, 12 days after they were forced to leave Halberstadt. Afterwards, we are not able to know their fate, but we can assume they might have been murdered in Treblinka, as most of Jews from Warsaw were. So he also identifies a number of further people in his testimony. The first one marked with the first, the left arrow, blue arrow, is Ida Beer, born in 1886, and then Jutta Berliner and her mother Gerda Berliner, the daughter and the wife of the Chazan of the community of Halberstadt, as they were identified in his testimony. And then what we do is we start to search for the biographies and for hints of these people. At first, we find them on the deportation list, which still exists. So I have Ida Beer with deportation number 100 from Halberstadt. I have Gerda and Jutta Berliner, as well as the couple Beversteins below. So we have their numbers. We know they've been in this transport. Later on, I checked for Yad Vashem, and we have pages of testimony, knowing that Ida Beer had a son who was able to give a page of testimony to Yad Vashem, giving us some information on her life, but actually I do not have yet any further information on her. We try to find more to be able to tell her story in more depth. For Gerda and Jutta Berliner, we find a bit more, as Yehuda Berry, as he called himself later on. Yehuda Berliner also gave pages of testimony to Yad Vashem in 1972. And we have a card that shows us they were organizing their emigration to Palestine, and from this card we know they had the Polish citizenship, that her husband and their husband and father already had been able to or went to the UK, and we know the last places of residence. They might have chosen more freely than the one they've been deported from. So this is the example that I brought from Halberstadt. And the second one is the deportation from Brandenburg an der Havel, which is a different picture series, and it's really a series. And we know for this deportation that the photos were taken by the police officer who was in charge of the deportation. The first row of pictures of this deportation on the 13th of April 1942 were taken on a courtyard, on the police courtyard in Brandenburg Havel. And actually it is the courtyard, as we now know, of the part of the police complex in Brandenburg Havel, where the policemen themselves resided. Because what you can see in the background in the middle two photos, thank you, in the middle two photos is a construction where you can hang up your laundry. Then we have two photos showing the forced march through the city, and we have two different photos, but in different formats, showing the situation at the train station. Here, we don't know really what happened, but we know survivors from Brandenburg Havel found these pictures and brought them to the newly founded community archive in Berlin in 45-46. They were later given then back to the city archive of Brandenburg Havel. Someone who was quite knowledgeable about the Jewish community in Brandenburg Havel was writing down on this photo, which is a group photo, a staged group photo. We have a number of these staged group photos from different places. So the Gestapo actually took these photos quite often and wrote down, as far as this person knew, the names. And then we have the annotation that the whole transport was brought to Warsaw, and also the question where the children are from this transport. The children, most of them actually went to school in Berlin because only a Jewish school was available in Berlin, and then were integrated in this transport from Berlin onwards. So this is how we are able to identify, or starting the process of identification for this photo. And I brought this because I think it shows two different ways we can start our research. Either we have memories and testimonies of survivors, or we have actually notes that are passed on to us on the back side of photos. And there's a lot of information on these back sides. And here for Brandenburg Havel, I just wanted to show you how we try to locate. And in Brandenburg Havel, this is quite possible within the city. So you have the 1942 photo on the left and a 2022 photo on the right. And you can see the buildings in the background are pretty much the same. There's not much change, and you also have the tram line going in front of the deportees, and it's still going around the street. So it's pretty clear that we got nearly the right angle in our nowadays photo here. For the second photo, it's not that easy because, as you can see, part of the building structure's changed. It is the same street, but we can't really say where on the street the photo has been taken. We're quite sure that we got the right angle, but it could have been a few meters into both directions, front or back here. It gets more difficult at the train station because you have different changes that were done to the train station. So we know more roughly where the photos were taken here. What we tried to do then was to map the march, the forced march, and the deportation routes through the city. And I just bring this to your attention for a moment because it shows how very public the situation was. Again, with the Halberstadt photos. The Halberstadt photos, the Halberstadt deportation takes place in the middle of the city, right in front of the dome, where each and everyone is able to see it. And maybe you have seen the bystanders on the photo. There was quite a number of bystanders on one of the photos. And also here for Brandenburg-Havel, you can see they walked about 1.5 kilometers, about roughly a mile through the town, through the city center of the town to reach the train station at broad daylight. And this is something that happens again and again. So we have from 2 or 3 of these 60 cities and towns photos that were taken at night. Most of the photos and most of the deportations actually were taking place in broad daylight, often as the picture series that we are using in the digital learning application from Eisenach on Saturdays. So there were more people who were actually able to watch because they've been going to the market, had some leisure time, went out to get a newspaper, whatever you did on a Saturday. But you were not sitting in the office or were working somewhere behind the doors. You've been able to be outdoors. So what we try to show is the visibility as well, and how this visibility is ingrained into the cities and how these deportation routes are actually ingrained into the city and make that more visible and memorable. So a very short outlook because I already got this 30 minutes sign. What we hope to achieve is that the online edition, the publication, with the in-depth annotation that we are currently preparing of the photos will allow for new research questions as well, as you will be able to compare these photos, for example, for the first time in a systematic way. And we also hope, of course, for broad public interest. We hope to engage local knowledge. I have to say, not for these 2 examples I've chosen, but for many places, that there is a lot of local knowledge on the deportation photos. But I think the publication or the digital picture atlas we are preparing will help to intensify local discourse. And in a later step, we hope for a more transnational perspective, the integration of different regions and countries of Nazi-occupied Germany with partners. But this depends, of course, further funding. But to finish on a hopeful note, the initial stage will be launched in about roughly 6 months. So it's March 7th. When the public launch of last seen as the picture atlas as well as the learning application will take place, and then we will invite for a public conference in English and German on the 14th and 15th of March 2023. So I hope I've given you a broader introduction into the project with some of the details we are working on. I thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's so difficult when we're in a webinar setting. We all are applauding individually.
I also thank you, Alina, very much for this presentation. Maybe before we start with the Q&A, can you just give us a little bit more details on what is the funding situation? So who was actually funding this project until now, and what about the future? And maybe also thinking when the project is launched for the public, what does the actual work behind the scenes kind of, how does this go further?
I think one of the most important questions right now. So currently we are funded by the German Ministry of Finances by a special budget that comes from the situation that less and less recompensations to survivors are paid because it is no longer possible to pay them reparations. So it was decided that this money should go into educational projects. And a new program was developed, and this is run and directed by the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future, which was set up to organize the recompensation of forced and slave laborers. And since then is an agency for a lot of different projects and for funding of these projects. And we are funded now until the 31st of March 2023. And whatever happens after that, we do have, of course, a few ideas and we are applying for funding. But at the current moment, we do not know what will happen after the 31st of March 2023. What will, of course, be is that the digital tools that we are developing will be available. This is made possible by all partners involved, and they will be hosted and there will be redactions. But what we will need is further funding.
Thank you for that answer and question, Wolf. So now we're going to turn to your questions and comments. Please, you have multiple ways of doing it. You can type into the chat, you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom, or use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. And my colleague Maya will moderate. While we're waiting for questions to come in, maybe I'll start with one, which is, why the focus on where the photos were taken as they look today? Why is that important for the project?
That is a question I've never been asked in a German context. And I think this is also already part of the answer. It has a meaning and an immediate connection if you see these photos located at a current day place. So to actually know it did happen in this space, it has a link towards the past for those who are currently inhabiting the present space. And this is one of the reasons why we are focusing on this. And it is also, of course, in telling the story to make it more visible where it actually happened, not to just have it as a historical photo, but to show it in situ. And I think photos of the current day situation show that differently as maps, but within the digital picture atlas, we will have it on a map so that you actually have the concrete or the actual geolocations of each of the photos. And then in the later stage of the project, we hope to include nowadays photos. But right now, they are tools for our research, for our understanding actually, and for our decoding of the photos. Also to sometimes you don't have annotations on these photos where they've been taken. So it's really important to know where in the city it was located.
Great. So I'm going down through the queue. We had one question that was entered during the talk. My attention has been divided, so if this was answered in the previous question that Martha just posed, let me know. From Anonymous, and then they also said I've been coming and going, so I may have missed these answers. Will those performing the roundups be identified and named? And does this run into issues with German data protection laws? And then they had one other question, but I think we'll start with that.
So this is actually a very difficult question. When we are still discussing. So when we do have Gestapo perpetrators who we know by name and who were tried after the war, it is pretty easy to name them and to have the biographical data. But what do we do with a volunteer from the German Red Cross? Or what do we do with a volunteer member of a fire brigade who were also involved in the deportations and who are pictured on these photos, who are in a non-official capacity, who were not tried afterwards? And some of these cases, we were able to identify them, and we will identify them. But of course, the biographical data that we are able to deliver depends on the actual status of the perpetrator. Once someone has been tried, the situation is different.
That I think that answer also ties into a question that just came in, asking about the concern that some of the German police, quote unquote, escorting might be recognized, like in the family resemblances. And so, but I think that ties into that answer of the complications with that.
While
yes.
Maya is searching, I'll ask another question which relates to the question I asked earlier. Is the geographical and historical information being actively shared with municipal authorities and/or local Jewish communities so these deportation spots can get a marker?
In many of these towns, they are already marked. They're not, for example, they are not marked in Brandenburg-Havel, but there's also this large civic engagement project in Germany called Stolpersteine, Stumbling Stones, which is marking the last voluntarily chosen residence of a persecuted person with a small plaque in the ground before this building. There are some cities who are not joining within this initiative, like Munich. They have a different format, but we have kind of a network of localizations of where individual people lived who were or fell victim to these deportations. Then we do have the situation that some of the deportation places are already marked, others not. And for example, which part of the deportation march in Brandenburg should we mark? Is it the starting point, somewhere through the city, or the train station? Or is it potentially at a later stage another format like an app when you're walking the city, that you get the information where you're actually walking, or that you have kind of a guided tour that marks these places? So we are not yet actively reaching out to local authorities, but we are, of course, actively in contact with local archives, and local archives are part of the local administrative structure in Germany. So we are discussing with them, and we are trying to give back the knowledge that we are assembling. There is, of course, sometimes the situation that actually it's been perfectly researched on a local level. We can only say thank you, and we are trying to acknowledge the work that's already been done. But when we can add on through the work we've done, like for example for Halberstadt now, we try to actively share that, and hopefully this will then lead up to a local discourse, and locally an initiative should start. But I think this is always something that should start more locally.
I wanted to just pick up on one question I saw in the chat, which was, are we interested as a project in finding photographs which are held by, for example, a survivor, descendants of survivors, private persons? And there is a big yes. just to say, because this is actually the hope also why we do this webinar, not only to encourage museums in the US or in other English-speaking countries like in Australia or South Africa to encourage to look into their kind of holdings, but especially to the community of survivors, because as Alina showed with this tremendous example from Halberstadt, where the survivor showed the photographs in the interview to the Shoah Foundation, we hope that actually many more families might have pictures which are interesting and important for the project. And not only this, but also to help with identifying the people, because I think it is really important, which also goes to another question which I saw in the chat. I think this is an important project, not only to recognize the story of the victims, but also to counter a Holocaust denial.
I'll jump in while Maya is fielding lots of chats and Q&As. We have a question about the digital organization of the photographs. When these are going to be cataloged into the digital picture atlas, how do you ensure consistency across entries? Will the metadata be searchable, and by what terms? Date, location, person depicted, etc. And this viewer is particularly interested because of the picture atlas being both in German and in English. So could you talk a little bit about the cataloging of these images?
Yeah, I've just today finished the process of discussing the database structure, and the database is now running full steam, I may say. And the database is where we assemble overall information that then is played out in the digital picture atlas. So the way we are organizing it is by date, place, but also by a number of searchable categories. These are for about places. They're about objects, they're about situations. So you will be able to search for photos that show certain elements of the deportation process. For example, the moment when luggage is brought or luggage is transported. You will be able to search for photos that show certain police measures. You'll be able also to search for photos that show bystander perspectives. So we are trying to find different ways, or thinking through different ways. You would like to search through the collection of photos and then to ask your own questions using a number of filters that can be then also added to each other. So you can, of course, look then for female perpetrators, or you could look for photos that are taken 41 in a certain region, and then looking only for photos that have been taken from a police commissioned photographer. So there's a couple of these, and then all data that we are producing minus data where there might be some questions of personal data security involved will be transferable through an API to other projects who are interested to use this data. So we try to be as much as open access as possible, but of course there are limitations because of data protection issues. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. And I have our next question, and thank you for the rapid fire questions from Nomi. Has there been publicity through the German newspapers requesting that anyone who finds photos, for example, like in their attics or other locations, that they send them to you?
We do have, whenever the exhibition is shown at a place, a lot of local newspaper coverage or media coverage. Also at the launch of the project, we had some national newspaper coverage, but of course we do have gaps. And Professor Wolf Gruner will know this even better than me. maybe the most stressful gap for the project like this, and for everyone who's discussing the deportation history from Berlin, is actually that even though Berlin has had so many deportations, we're talking over 60 regular deportations and more than 130 small-scale deportations, no photo is existent. There's no photo from Hamburg. There's no photo from Frankfurt am Main. Huge, large Jewish communities. We have the Breslau pictures, we have photos from Munich, but from most of the large German cities with a major Jewish community, no photos are existing. This is a gap. This is inexplicable. It must have been somewhere around who took photos, especially in Berlin. So it's not for the first time that we asked, and Christoph Kreuzmüller, who's been part of the project from day one onwards, asked for photos in the last few years in Berlin again and again, but not yet. We have not yet found them, but I'm still believing they're existing, and we need to alter our search strategies, but it may also take some time until people come forward and show those photos, because these are photos from the perpetrator society. And I think this is also something that needs to be recognized, why there might be some hesitation to share these photographs or photo albums.
Thank you for that. And I just want to thank those of you who are putting comments into the chat. We are going to share those with Alina. And I'm sure it's so helpful for the other attendees as well about similar project in Hungary, Our Forgotten Neighbors, and other projects. We need to wrap up the Q&A in about 5 minutes, but I know that Maya has another one in queue, so I will hand it over to them.
Yes, this is a question from Paulina. Will details of the photographs be examined, such as the clothing of the deportees, the emotions on their faces, the type of luggage carried, the attitude of others present in the photographs, etc.?
Not at this point of the project, especially as we have to limit the number of searchable terms, and also because at the end we have 500 photos so far. At this point, if you would search for certain emotions, you would be getting 1, 2, 3 photos. So we leave this to researchers to actually work with these photos. But once we are at a point to hopefully very soon broaden up the project, it would be very interesting to include further keywords or searchable terms. But also, of course, these are terms that once you're cataloging it are very personal and individual. So what we try right now is to be on a quite on a level where these question of what we are cataloging is visible for, I think, most people who are looking into these photos, because we all interpret photos differently. Visual images are different to everyone who is looking into them and reading into them. But certain kinds of buildings, certain kinds of informations is what we are focusing right now. But I like this idea very much for later stages of the project.
Do we have time for one more question, or are we wrapping up? Let's see.
You can ask one more if you have it in queue, but otherwise we need to wrap up.
Okay. There was the one question from Ulrich. I think just asking after why no photos exist from deportations, from, like, as you mentioned, from like Frankfurt, Hamburg, Berlin. Is this possibly due to a larger loss of public archives in cities that were heavily damaged during the war, or these archives may have been quote unquote cleansed before they were seized?
I guess this is one of the reasons that in 1944-45, And afterwards, lots of materials were lost due to different reasons. But one of these reasons is the cleansing of archives, of course, and archival holdings. But I actually guess that there's something else to it as well. The visibility in Berlin was so high that either you got so accustomed to the situation that it was no longer worthy to take a photo, or actually they are still existing and not shared. And they might be not shared voluntarily, or but just because a later generation does not know what these photos are showing. Because I think this is something we should not underestimate. It's not easy to recognize a deportation photo from time to time. You'd see people with luggage standing around. This could be also 1946. It could be some other situation. You're not really sure if it's within the territory of the Reich or if it's maybe from after the German invasion of Poland. So I think it's really difficult to decode this photos, and this is why we ask people to actually show us and discuss with us whatever they might have, and have a very broad approach. Not asking them, please show us the deportation pictures that you might have inherited, but those photos from 33 to 45, we look through them together.
Yeah, and maybe I can add to this. There's another reason why, for example, informal photographs don't exist, because the Gestapo was very adamant in arresting people who took pictures of the persecution. So we found in police diaries in Berlin dozens of people getting arrested for taking pictures of Kristallnacht, for example. So I assume similar things happened also during the deportations. But on the other hand, the whole project is about the hope that we actually find these pictures. And so I want to just call up on everybody, please distribute the information about the project, especially to people of maybe German origin, survivor communities, museums, archives in the English-speaking world, to help us find new pictures, and especially also to find information. And to wrap this up, I want to first thank our co-sponsor, the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide and Human Rights Studies, which is also worth checking out because there's a lot of programming regarding these topics ongoing. And I want to especially thank Maya and Martha for all the kind of organizational effort. And then Alina, this was really an insightful presentation, and I hope we find funding for this joint project so that we not only can really go into more depth regarding the German pictures, but also at a later stage where we can include Austria, Poland, France, to really make this a more European project, because as I said earlier, it is so important to recognize not only the victims, but also to work against kind of Holocaust denial. So thank you a lot, and maybe everybody who is still here, give a warm hand to Alina for the presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here.